The first thing Ray Kowalski noticed when he pulled into the driveway was the silence. Not the comfortable kind of silence that settles over a neighborhood on a warm Tuesday afternoon, the kind where dogs nap in patches of sun and sprinklers tick lazily over lawns, where the whole world seems to be exhaling slowly. This was a different kind of silence. A held breath kind. The kind that lives just before something breaks. He sat on his motorcycle for a long moment after cutting the engine, his big hands resting on his thighs, his eyes moving over the house the way a man scans a road he doesn't trust. It was a modest place, pale yellow siding gone a little gray at the edges, a flower bed that had seen better decades, a wind chime on the porch that wasn't moving because there was no wind. There was a basketball hoop in the driveway with no net. There was a pink bicycle leaning against the garage wall with training wheels still attached, though the girl who owned it was 9 now and hadn't needed those training wheels in 3 years. Nobody had bothered to take them off. Ray noticed all of it. He was a man who noticed things. He swung his leg over the bike and stood to his full height, 6'2", broad across the chest and shoulders in the way that comes not from a gym but from decades of physical work and hard living. His cut, the leather vest that marked him as a full-patch member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, was worn soft with age, the patches faded but still legible. A death's head grinned from his back. His forearms were sleeved in tattoos that told the story of a life lived mostly outside the lines of what polite society would call respectable. He had not been to this house in 7 years. He had not seen his daughter in 7 years. He told himself, as he walked up the front path, that he was ready for that. He had prepared for it. He had spent the better part of the past week, ever since his sister Darlene had called him at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, her voice shaking in a way he'd never heard before, going over every version of how this moment might go. He had imagined Lily looking at him the way children look at strangers. He had imagined her not recognizing him at all. He had imagined her turning away. He had imagined a lot of things. He had not imagined what he actually saw. He knocked on the door. There was a pause, long enough that he was about to knock again, and then it swung open, and there was his daughter. Lily. She was 9 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, big and brown and fringed with lashes so thick they looked painted on, and she had his jaw, that same stubborn, squared-off jaw that his own mother used to cup in her hand when she wanted his full attention. She was wearing a yellow t-shirt with a sunflower on it and a pair of jeans with a grass stain on the left knee. She was looking up at him with an expression that was carefully, deliberately neutral, the expression of a child who has learned, the hard way, that showing what she feels is not always safe. And she had no hair. Her head had been shaved. Not styled short, not given a pixie cut, shaved, roughly, unevenly, as though it had been done quickly and without care, with patches still slightly longer than others and one small nick near her left ear that had scabbed over. Her scalp was pale. She looked simultaneously younger than 9 and much, much older. Ray Kowalski stood in the doorway of his ex-wife's house, and something inside him, something he had spent 7 years building, brick by careful brick, a wall he was honestly quite proud of, came apart so completely and so quietly that he almost didn't notice it happening. He just felt it go. Like a dam giving way, not with drama but with a kind of terrible, inevitable resignation. "Hi," Lily said. Her voice was small. "Aunt Darlene said you were coming." He crouched down so he was at her level. His throat was doing something complicated. He cleared it. "Hey, Bug," he said, and his voice came out rough. "I'm your dad." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, something quick and frightened, and then, just as quickly, locked back away. "I know," she said. 7 years is a long time in anyone's life. In Ray Kowalski's life, it had been long enough to get sober, get his act partially together, ride 30,000 miles, lose 2 friends, find God briefly and then lose him again, gain a niece he adored, and slowly, persistently, achingly come to terms with every bad decision he had ever made. There had been a lot of them. The marriage to Sandra had been the best and worst thing that had ever happened to him simultaneously, which is not as uncommon as people like to pretend. They had met when he was 26 and she was 23, at a roadhouse bar outside of Tulsa where Ray had stopped for the night on a long run south. Sandra was waitressing, working 2 jobs to save money for a nursing program she eventually never enrolled in, and when she brought him his beer she looked him dead in the eye in a way that most people, especially most women, didn't look at Ray Kowalski, and she said, "You look like someone who's running from something." And he had laughed, because it was so exactly true that it was funny. They were married 8 months later. Lily came 2 years after that. The years in between Lily's birth and the end of the marriage were not years Ray was proud of. He had been drinking. Then, not casually, not socially, but in the way that becomes a second career, a full-time occupation, a thing you organize your whole life around without ever quite admitting that's what you're doing. The club was his world, and the club's world was not a stable one. There were runs and rallies and long disappearances that Sandra bore with increasing tightness around her eyes and mouth. There were arguments that shook the walls. There were nights he didn't come home, and when he did come home he was not always someone she or Lily should have been around. He was not physically violent. He wanted to be clear about that, always. With himself, he had never raised a hand to Sandra or to Lily, not once, not ever. But there is more than one way to damage a household, and he had found most of the other ones. Sandra filed for divorce when Lily was 2. Ray, in one of the clearest-eyed decisions he had ever made, did not contest it. He knew what he was. He knew what he wasn't. He signed the papers and he got on his bike and he told himself he was doing the right thing, the selfless thing, and he rode and he drank and he did not call, and gradually the not calling became easier and the distance became a kind of geography he lived in. And then 1 year became 2 and 2 became 5 and 5 became 7 and Lily became a little girl he knew only from 2 photographs that Darlene sent him against Sandra's wishes, and he kept those photographs in the inside pocket of his cut, close to his chest, and sometimes late at night when the road was dark and quiet he would think about them and feel something so large and formless that he could not name it, and so he usually stopped thinking about them pretty quickly. He got sober 4 years ago. In a church basement in Flagstaff, Arizona, with a sponsor named Gerald who was 63 years old and had the patience of a man who had seen everything and been surprised by none of it. Getting sober did not fix Ray Kowalski. It just removed the thing he'd been hiding behind, and then he had to figure out what was back there. That took a while. He had been thinking about Lily more and more. He had been thinking about what it might mean to reach out, to try, to do the terrifying and possibly humiliating thing of introducing himself to his own daughter. He didn't know how Sandra would react. He didn't know how Lily would react. He knew he had no right to expect anything, and that knowledge made the whole prospect so daunting that he kept putting it off, telling himself he needed to be more stable first, more ready, more worthy of the conversation. And then Darlene called. Darlene was his younger sister by 4 years, and she was the only family Ray had that he was still close to. She was also the only person in his life who spoke to him with complete honesty regardless of whether he wanted to hear it, which was either her greatest quality or her most annoying one depending on the day. She had stayed loosely in touch with Sandra over the years, not close, not friendly exactly, but in that careful orbit of people who share a child between them and try to do right by everyone even when everyone makes it difficult. What Darlene told him on that Thursday night was this: Sandra had remarried, 18 months ago. His name was Craig Heller. He was 38, worked in insurance, coached Little League badly, and had, in Darlene's assessment, which Ray had found to be generally reliable over the course of a lifetime, something wrong with him that she couldn't quite put her finger on but that had been making her uneasy for months. Darlene had seen Lily at Sandra's birthday dinner 3 weeks prior. Lily had been quiet in a way that was different from her normal quiet, not shy, not reserved, but shut down, like something inside her had gone offline. She hadn't wanted to eat. She'd sat close to Sandra and watched Craig with her peripheral vision in a way that Darlene described, and then stopped and started over, and said, "Ray." She was watching him the way a dog watches a person who has kicked it before. She had called Sandra the next day. Sandra had been defensive, then dismissive, then quietly, haltingly, admitted that there had been some tension at home. Craig had strong opinions about discipline. He believed children needed clear rules and clear consequences. Lily had been, Sandra said, using the word carefully, challenging, lately. Emotional, crying at things that shouldn't have made her cry. Talking back. Darlene had asked about the hair. There had been a long silence on Sandra's end. Craig, Sandra finally said, had found it necessary, when Lily had refused, for the 3rd time that week, to brush her hair before school, had in fact thrown her hairbrush across the bathroom in frustration. He had found it necessary to teach her a lesson about taking care of her things. About responsibility. About what happens when you don't comply. He had shaved her head. Darlene had sat with that for a moment. Then she had said, very quietly, "Sandra, that man shaved your 9-year-old daughter's head as a punishment." Sandra had started crying then. Real crying, the kind that sounds like it's been dammed up for a while. She said she knew. She said she hadn't known what to do. She said she loved him, and then she said she was scared of him, and those two things tumbled out of her in the same breath as though she had never separated them in her own mind, which perhaps she hadn't. She said Lily had been so good about it, so stoic, hadn't even cried. She said that was what scared her most, that Lily hadn't cried. Darlene had called Ray 20 minutes after she hung up with Sandra. "I need you to go get her," Darlene said. Not asked, said, and Ray, who had been running from this moment for 7 years, surprised himself by saying, "Okay." The inside of the house smelled like lavender and something underneath the lavender that Ray's nose, trained by years in places that smelled of motor oil and old leather and the particular funk of men living without much oversight, identified immediately as tension. Like ozone before a storm. Like a house that has learned to hold its breath. Sandra met him in the living room. She looked older than he remembered, but not badly. She had the look of a woman who had grown into herself, filled out some, with lines at the corners of her eyes that were partly from smiling and partly from other things. She was not smiling now. She was wearing a cardigan pulled tight around herself even though the room wasn't cold, and her eyes were red at the rims. "Ray," she said. "Sandra." There was a whole conversation in those two words that neither of them was ready to have. They skipped it. Lily had disappeared back into the house when she let him in, and now Sandra went to the doorway of the hall and called her name. They waited. There were footsteps on stairs, slow and deliberate, and then Lily reappeared and stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at Ray with those careful, guarded eyes. Craig was not home. This was intentional. Sandra had asked him to give her some space today, had said it carefully, diplomatically, the way you say things to a man who has made you afraid of saying things wrong, and he had left. He would be back by 6. It was now 3:30. Ray sat on the couch. He was a big man in a small room, and he was aware of how much space he occupied, how his presence could fill a space in ways that weren't always welcome. He tried to make himself smaller. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at Lily, who was still standing in the doorway. "You can come sit over here if you want," he said. "Or you can stay over there. Either way is fine with me." She stayed over there for a moment, measuring him. Then she came and sat at the far end of the couch, not next to him, not across the room. A careful middle distance. "Aunt Darlene talks about you sometimes," she said. "Yeah, what does she say?" "She says you ride motorcycles." "I do. She says you're not as scary as you look." Something shifted in his chest. She's probably right about that. Lily looked at her hands in her lap. Her fingernails were bitten down to the quick. He hadn't noticed that before. Children who bite their nails aren't doing it because they're bored. He knew that. He had bitten his own nails as a boy. In the house his father ruled with silences that were worse than shouting. "Does it bother you?" he asked. He nodded toward her head. "Can I ask about it?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very carefully, as though she had practiced this, "Craig said I needed to learn to take responsibility for my things." "Is that what Craig said?" "It'll grow back," she said, and her voice was still careful, still practiced, and then something cracked in it. "Just a hair, just a tiny fracture, it'll grow back, it's not a big deal, everybody acts like it's this huge thing but it'll grow back." "Yeah," Ray said, "it will, so it's fine, okay." She looked at him then, really looked at him, searching, as though she was trying to read something in his face. He didn't look away. He let her look. "Are you mad?" she asked. "About what?" "About me. About not seeing me. About..." She stopped. Started again. "Are you mad that you haven't been around?" He was quiet for a long moment. He could have said the easy thing, the thing that would have let both of them off the hook. He had thought about the easy thing on the long ride here. He had decided not to say it. "I'm not mad," he said. "I'm not mad at you, Lily. Not ever, not about anything. As for whether I'm mad at myself," he paused. "Yeah, I am. I've been mad at myself for a long time. I made choices that I'm not proud of, and one of the consequences of those choices was that I wasn't here. And that wasn't okay. It wasn't right, and I'm sorry for it." She absorbed this. She had the particular stillness of a child who is used to adults, words not matching their behavior, a child who has learned to hold information at arm's length until it proves itself true. "Mom says you were an alcoholic," she said. "I was. Are you still?" "I'm sober. 4 years. But once you're an alcoholic you're always an alcoholic. You just choose not to drink." She thought about this with the seriousness of someone who finds the information genuinely interesting. "That seems hard," she said finally. "It is," he said. "Worth it, Though, Sandra made them all tea, a gesture so ordinary and civilized that it felt slightly surreal to Ray, sitting in this house on this couch next to his 9-year-old daughter who was slowly, tentatively, beginning to uncurl. She brought out a plate of cookies too, the store-bought kind with the chocolate stripe pattern, and Lily took two and ate them methodically while Sandra sat in the armchair across from them and they all inhabited a fragile peace. Ray let Lily steer the conversation. He had decided this before he arrived, that he would not push, not press, not ask the questions he desperately wanted answered. He would let her choose the ground. She asked him, with increasing boldness as the hour went on, about his motorcycle. It was a 1987 Harley-Davidson Softail, and yes, it was loud, and yes, he wore a helmet even though she had apparently heard that bikers didn't. About whether he had a dog, he didn't, but he'd been thinking about it. About whether he'd ever been to Disneyland, he had not, and about whether he knew any famous people. He knew several people who were famous in contexts he decided not to specify in detail. She told him about school, that her favorite subject was science and her least favorite was gym, not because she wasn't athletic but because the gym teacher, Mr. Paris, had a whistle he blew too often and too loudly and it made her head hurt. She told him about her best friend Amara, who lived 2 streets over and had a trampoline. She told him about a book she was reading about a girl who discovered she could talk to plants, and she described the plot with the detailed enthusiasm of someone who has found a story that speaks to something private in them. She did not mention Craig again. She did not mention the shaved head again. She didn't need to. It was there in the room with all of them, sitting quietly in the corner like a thing nobody had introduced but everyone had noticed. At 5 o'clock, Sandra excused herself to start dinner, and Ray and Lily were briefly alone. Lily looked toward the kitchen doorway where Sandra had disappeared, and then she looked back at Ray, and something changed in her face. The careful composure shifted, just slightly, and what was underneath it was very tired and very young. "He's not like, mean all the time," she said. She was speaking quietly. "I want you to know that. He's nice sometimes. He took us to a water park in the summer." "Okay," Ray said. Sometimes I do things wrong and he gets really angry and I don't always know what I did wrong." She paused. "He's never hit me. I want to say that. He's never done that. I hear you. She touched the top of her head with one hand, almost unconsciously, a new habit, reaching for hair that wasn't there. "He just does things. And then he says it's because I need to learn. And Mom says he loves us and he's just trying to be a good stepdad, so." Ray said. "So I'm trying to be better," Lily said. "I'm really trying. I just keep messing up." Ray Kowalski had sat very still for a lot of this conversation. He was good at sitting still. It was something Gerald had taught him in the early days of sobriety, how to be present in a moment without immediately trying to solve or escape it. But this particular sentence, spoken in his daughter's small and thoroughly defeated voice, this was requiring a kind of stillness he wasn't sure he had the capacity for. He kept his voice even. "Lily," he said, "I want you to hear something, and I want you to really hear it, okay? Can you look at me?" She looked at him. "What happened to your hair is not something that happened because you messed up. Okay, that is not what you do to a child who messes up. That is not discipline. What happened to you is not okay, and it is not your fault, and you have not done anything wrong. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Her chin wobbled, just slightly. She locked it down. "Everyone says that," she said. "But, there's no but," he said, gently, firmly. "There is no version of the story where that was your fault. None." She looked at him for a long moment. And then, very slowly, the thing she'd been holding so carefully began to come apart. Her face crumpled. The tears came, not the dignified, controlled kind but the real kind, the convulsive kind, the kind that have been stored up too long and come out all at once and don't care who's watching. She cried the way you cry when you've been telling yourself you're fine for too long. She cried like a 9-year-old who has been trying very hard to be older than 9. Ray moved across the couch without thinking and pulled her into him, and she didn't resist. She went immediately, burrowing into his chest, her small fists grabbing the front of his shirt. He put one big hand on her bare head, gentle as he could make it, and he held her while she cried. He was crying too. He didn't try to hide it. Sandra appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. She took in the scene, her daughter curled against the man she'd once loved and then lost and then resented and had slowly, over years, simply filed away, both of them undone in the quiet of her living room, and her face did something complicated. She came and sat on the other side of Lily and put her hand on her daughter's back. Lily turned and grabbed her too, and for a moment all three of them were pressed together on that couch in a configuration that made no logical sense given their history and yet felt, somehow, like the only shape that fit. Ray looked at Sandra over the top of Lily's head. "I need to tell you something," Sandra said. Her voice was steady, but barely. "Okay. I didn't know it was going to be like this. With Craig, I need you to know I didn't know. He was..." She stopped. "He seemed so stable. After everything, I wanted stable. I wanted Lily to have stable. And by the time I understood what kind of stable he was, I didn't." She stopped again. "I didn't know how to get out." Ray was quiet. "I'm scared of him," she said, and it was clearly the first time she'd said those words out loud, in that order, to another person, because saying them seemed to release something in her. Not of being hurt, exactly, but, "He makes me feel like I'm always wrong. Like everything that goes badly is something I did or didn't do." And I started believing it. And Lily, her voice broke. Lily started believing it about herself too, and I let that happen, Ray. I let that happen because I didn't want to be alone again. I let my daughter think she was failing when she was perfect. She has always been perfect. "Mom," Lily said, muffled against her mother's shoulder. "You are," Sandra said fiercely. "You are absolutely perfect." Ray let them have the moment. Then he said, carefully, "Are you safe? Right now, today, are you safe?" He doesn't. I'm not asking what he does or doesn't do. I'm asking if you feel safe. Sandra looked at him. "No," she said quietly. "Not really." "Okay," Ray said. "He comes home at 6, she said. "I know." Ray looked at his watch. It was 5:45. What happened when Craig Heller walked through the door at 6:14 was not what Craig Heller had expected his Tuesday evening to contain. He was a trim man, Craig, not small but carefully maintained, with the look of someone who monitored himself closely and expected the same of others. He had a handsome face of the kind that photographs well and reveals itself slowly in person. He had, Ray noticed immediately, the eyes of a man who was always calculating. Always measuring the room for advantage and threat. He measured Ray. Ray stood up from the couch. In the years since getting sober, Ray had worked hard on his temper. He had worked on it the way you work on a knotted muscle, slowly, consistently, with a certain amount of pain. He was not a perfect man. He had never claimed to be. But he had learned, mostly, to stay the right side of his anger, to not let it drive. Looking at Craig Heller, at this ordinary-seeming man standing in the doorway of the house where his daughter lived and slept and was learning, slowly, to believe she was always in the wrong, he felt the anger. He felt it like a physical thing, heavy and hot. He breathed through it. "You must be Craig," he said. Craig's eyes went from Ray to Sandra to Lily, who had moved to stand next to her mother and was looking at the floor. "Who are you?" Craig said. His voice had the particular quality of a man accustomed to being the biggest thing in a room, recalibrating. "Ray Kowalski. I'm Lily's father." A pause. Craig's expression arranged itself into something diplomatic and slightly tight. "I didn't know Sandra had invited." "She didn't," Ray said. "I invited myself." The silence that followed was the kind that contains several futures depending on which word comes next. Craig said, "This isn't really a good time." "I'm sure it isn't," Ray said. Sandra said, "Craig, I'd like you to leave," Craig said to Ray. His voice had taken on a quality that Ray recognized, the steady, controlled tone of a man who uses his composure as a weapon, who communicates authority through restraint the way others communicate it through volume. "I'll be leaving," Ray said. "I'll be taking Lily with me when I go." "That's not something you get to decide." "I have parental rights," Ray said. "I have a lawyer. I have a very good relationship with a family court judge in this county who happens to owe me a favor, and I have photographs that I took on my phone this afternoon of what you did to my daughter's head. So what I have, Craig, is options. What I want to know is whether we're going to do this the easy way or the considerably less comfortable way, because I promise you I am prepared for both." This was partially true and partially informed by the frantic 2-hour phone call Ray had made to his lawyer, a man named Davis who had handled the motorcycle club's legal affairs for 15 years, immediately after leaving Darlene's the previous week. Davis had walked him through what he could and couldn't do. There were processes. There were channels. There were things that took time. He had filed the paperwork. He had taken the photographs. He had documentation of Sandra's fear and Lily's condition that Davis said was sufficient to request emergency temporary custody pending a full hearing. He had also made absolutely certain that Sandra was prepared to support the petition, which she was, and that she had her own legal representation, which Davis had helped arrange. Craig stared at him for a long moment. The calculation in his eyes was rapid and precise, going through the variables. Then something shifted, some recognition of the architecture of the situation, of the thing he was actually standing in front of, not just the tall man with tattoos but everything behind and around him. He looked at Sandra. She held his gaze and said nothing. He looked at Lily. Lily did not look up from the floor. And in that small, contained moment, in his daughter not looking up at the man who should have been her safe place and couldn't be, Ray felt something settle inside him. Not rage, resolve. I think, Craig said slowly, we should talk about this like adults. I agree completely, Ray said. Let's start with you going back out the door you came in, giving Sandra and Lily some space tonight, and calling your own attorney tomorrow morning. That would be a very adult way to begin. Craig left. Ray stayed until 9. He helped Lily with the last of her math homework, which he was genuinely terrible at and which made Lily laugh, actually laugh, for the first time, a real laugh, unguarded, that she quickly tried to smother and then didn't bother smothering. He ate the dinner Sandra had made. He washed the dishes. Before he left, he crouched down in the hallway so he was at Lily's level and he said, I'm going to be around. That's not a promise I'm making lightly. I know it doesn't mean anything yet. But I'm going to be around. And when you need me you can call me, and I will come. Okay, she looked at him, 9 years old, with her shorn head and her bitten fingernails in her mother's eyes, standing in the hallway of a house that was about to change, that had to change, that had already started changing from the moment he walked through the door. Okay, she said. Then, very quietly, Dad. It was the first time she'd said it. Just the one word. She said it like she was testing the shape of it in her mouth, seeing if it fit. He felt it in his chest like something opening. Yeah, Bug, he said. Will you come back? Yeah, he said. I will. He rode home in the dark, the long flat highway unspooling in front of him, the night air cold and clean, and he cried for most of it, not from sadness exactly, or not only from sadness, but from the release of something he had carried so long he'd stopped feeling its weight, only noticing now, with it partially lifted, how much it had cost him. How much time, how much distance. All the road he'd put between himself and the two most important people he'd ever failed, and the strange and terrifying and overwhelming grace of being allowed, possibly, to try again. He called Gerald when he got home. She called me Dad, he said. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, how do you feel? Like the world just started over, Ray said. Yeah, Gerald said, it kind of did. The legal process, as legal processes go, was neither quick nor easy, but it moved. Davis, who was a bulldog in courtrooms and kept threatening retired status and never actually retiring, filed the emergency motion within 48 hours. The family court judge, who did not, technically, owe Ray a favor, but to whom Davis had several excellent professional relationships, reviewed the documentation and photographs and Sandra's affidavit and Craig's history, which included a prior domestic incident in another county that had not resulted in charges but had resulted in a paper trail, and granted temporary supervised custody to Ray while the full hearing was scheduled. Craig Heller did not fight it. Whether this was because Davis communicated the full weight of what Ray was prepared to do if he did, or because Craig, faced with the actual legal machinery of consequences, made a calculation about his own best interests, Ray never knew for certain. He suspected both. He did not particularly care. What mattered was that on a Friday afternoon, 11 days after that first visit, he drove a car he'd borrowed from Darlene, because Lily could not ride on a motorcycle, which was a thing he had not thought about until he had to Sandra's house, and Lily came out the front door with a backpack and a stuffed animal rabbit she introduced as Mr. Carrots, but his real name is Gerald, which delighted Ray for reasons he kept to himself, and she got in the car. Sandra stood on the porch. She and Ray looked at each other for a moment over the top of the car. Take care of her, Sandra said. That's the plan, he said. He had leased a 2-bedroom apartment. It was clean, if sparse, with a good neighborhood and a school that Davis had verified had a good reputation. He had bought a bed with a purple comforter because Darlene had told him Lily's favorite color was purple. He had bought a small bookshelf and stocked it with books that Darlene had helped him choose, including 2 more in the series about the girl who talked to plants. He had put a hook by the door for a bicycle helmet because he was going to get her a bicycle without training wheels and teach her to ride it properly, and that was a thing he was looking forward to with a sort of quiet intensity that surprised him. He was not ready for this. He was fully aware he was not ready for this. He had never lived with a child. He barely knew his daughter. He had spent 7 years being, in the most fundamental sense, absent. He had no idea what he was doing. He was going to do it anyway. The first week was hard in the ways he'd expected and hard in ways he hadn't. Lily was not an easy child to read. She had learned, over the course of her 9 years and especially the past 18 months, to keep herself close to the surface, to not want things too openly, to adapt rather than express. She was helpful and quiet and ate what was put in front of her without complaint, and these things, which might have looked like easy virtues, broke Ray's heart a little because they were not virtues, they were survival strategies. They were what you did when you'd learned that wanting things loudly got you in trouble. He worked at it patiently. He made mistakes, overreacted once to something small and saw her flinch, which undid him completely, and he sat down on the kitchen floor and explained that he was angry at a situation and not at her, and that in this house she was allowed to make noise, she was allowed to be messy, she was allowed to want things and say so, and she could throw her hairbrush against the bathroom wall if she needed to, and the worst that would happen was he'd ask her to pick it up. She stared at him sitting on the kitchen floor for a long moment, and then she sat down on the floor next to him and leaned against the cabinet and said, "You're kind of weird, you know that?" And he said yes, he knew that. He took her to school and picked her up. He sat with her through homework he mostly couldn't help with and found a high school girl 2 apartments down who tutored for $15 an hour and who Lily liked immediately. He watched movies with her on Friday nights. She had opinions about movies that she had apparently been keeping to herself for some time and now delivered with increasing confidence, and her opinions were often better than his. He took her to the park on weekends and taught her to ride a bicycle without training wheels, which took 3 afternoons and left her with a scraped elbow and a triumph on her face that he photographed and sent to Darlene and to Sandra and to Gerald, who texted back 3 exclamation points. He called Sandra every few days. Those calls were their own strange, careful geography, 2 people navigating the aftermath of old wreckage, trying to do right by the person they both loved. Sandra was getting counseling. Sandra was working through things. Sandra missed Lily fiercely and called her every night, and Ray handed the phone over without comment. The love between Sandra and her daughter was real and intact. It had survived Craig, had survived the fear and the confusion, the way the deepest loves do, not easily and not without scarring but whole at the core. Lily still talked about Craig sometimes, in the matter-of-fact way children discuss things they're trying to understand. She said once, lying on the couch watching television, not looking at Ray, "I know he wasn't good. I'm not sad he's gone. But I keep thinking, did I do something to make him that way? Like, was I the thing that made him angry all the time?" Ray muted the television. "No," he said, "no, Lily. Some people come already with their anger inside them. It's not something you caused or